Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Words of Life podcast with Adam Kitt and Kevin Bruni. Hello, Kevin.
Hey, Adam, how you doing?
I am pretty good. Had an amazing weekend, and of course, we're having some internet issues up here, so I had to move upstairs out of my office, and we're going to hope for the best. But yeah, it's been a really great last few days for me. How about yourself? What's going on with you?
Yeah, it's been an interesting day around here. We had our foster baby go back to mom today, full time. So she's
Oh,
our third
wow.
one, and she's now back with mom as of today. So we're hoping that all goes well, and we'll see what comes next. But
That's great. So, is it a process where the mother just needed to go through some training and some transition stuff, or how does that work?
yeah, it depends on the case. In this case, mom had some substance abuse issues that she had to get through rehab and things and show sobriety, and she's really done an amazing job. So kudos to her. But yeah, she did all the work she needed to do and got through all the milestones and things that she needed to meet. So she got her kid back at we've had her for 7 months. Baby is 9 months old, and we had gotten her straight out of the NICU because she was premature. So it's the first time she's ever lived with mom in her house. So we'll hope it all goes well. I mean, there's been some visits and things, obviously, but yeah,
Yep.
this is for real for her now. So
Yeah, for absolutely. Well, I am experiencing internet issues, so hopefully this goes well.
yeah,
And if you're getting this in the future, whenever you're seeing this, just be forgiving and give us some grace with the technology issues that we may be having. So many of you know that I'm a singer. I love to sing. I sing in a men's chorus called the Sound of Tennessee Chorus out of Cleveland, Tennessee, which is about an hour south of me. And the chorus had a retreat this weekend. So we got Friday night and all day Saturday, where we got together and got coached by an amazing high level music expert named Aaron Dale, and that was super cool. Lots of singing, lots of high end, just growth with the chorus, and just camaraderie and all that. So that was really neat. And then I got to preach at the Athens congregation, which is just about half an hour north of Cleveland. So I was already kind of down
yeah,
there. I just went straight from the retreat site to preaching on Sunday. And what's really neat about this podcast for me is that it gives me a really good source of active new material that I've never written before. So my sermon was all on a lot of the stuff we talked about last week, which was very great, and it was well received. And you know, I, I don't preach full time, so I felt it was one of the best sermons that I had done, both in how well it came off in terms of my delivery of the
yeah,
content, and then of course the response by the people saying it was really impactful, and they were very appreciative of my thoughts. So it was neat. It was really good to have that experience, that opportunity to grow. So
awesome.
all right. So getting into and back into our study last week, we pretty much finished up this section here of chapter 4 all the way through verse 16. And a big part of it was, at least at the tail end, just to kind of get us back into the context here, is we left off with the idea of if anybody's lacking faith or having this lack of confidence in their salvation, this is really the place you want to go, because time and time again John reiterates the fact this is how we know God, and that God is in us, and that it's really focused on the idea of love, that God is love, and in God, we being his children can know that we are his children by the way we love one another. um,
Yep.
I'll let you continue on with the recap there. I've talked a lot. So
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's this great thing where he talks about this, right? That we can know we know, right? Is his real idea, and it's all about the love we show for one another, and it's this based on this idea that God is love. So if God is love, then if He dwells in us, right, we can know that He dwells in us by the way we love one another, because that's what He did, right? He loved mankind. He so loved the world, right? And so in that we love one another. Then God lives in us, and His love is made complete in us, and this is how we know that we live in Him and He's in us, right? And then we have this idea that He's given us of His Spirit, which we can talk a little more about. And he ties up sort of back to the beginning there at the end in 15 and 16, back to this is how we know the Spirit of God. You testify that Jesus is the Son of God. And that goes back to the beginning where he's talking about testing or trying the spirits, right? We know we have His Spirit in us when we believe that Jesus is the Son of God. God lives in Him in us. When we actually love in truth and in deed. And that's how we know He loves us. We love Him. We love the brothers. God is in us. It's a true Spirit of God and not some other spirit. And yeah, it's just this great thing of how we can know. And this is, again, not the only place John does this in this sermon here about giving confidence or reassurance to the listener or the reader. So.
absolutely. So let's go ahead and pick it up in our next section here, the end of chapter 4. And if you want to just kind of just read until you feel we've read enough.
Yeah, so on the screen there, we've got sort of the end of 16 that we just had before, but let's pick up there. So God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. That's a lot of stuff in there. So maybe we'll just stop there for a second before we get to
Yeah.
the reason we love.
Yeah.
So again, this is really carrying on with that idea of confidence, right? I mean, he says it there in 17. This is how we have confidence in the day of judgment. And so, we sometimes might read, Jesus's teachings where he'll talk about the day of judgment. He'll say to those on the right, and those on the left, right? And there were people there in some of those stories that he's telling. I don't know if they're parables, probably not. They're just sort of like him explaining this, what it's going to be like, right? Almost like a prophecy. There's people there who are surprised in the day of judgment, right? Hey, didn't we do all these things? Right? And so we might read those things and say, whoa, man, how am I going to know? Maybe I think I've got it down and I'm going to be surprised on the day of judgment as well, right? So how can I might have fear or trepidation about that. And so he's really trying to combat that human thought we might have, right? Here's how we can have confidence on the day of judgment. And so he's telling us that it's through this love. Perfect love is what drives out that fear. We don't have to be afraid of that punishment that's coming. And again, the reason he says that is because the love of God, the love of Christ, is complete in us and among us, right? So it's not just a me thing; it's a how I relate to the us sort of a situation there, right? Because when I do that, when I live in that way, then what he says there is, in the world, then we are like Jesus. And look, if I'm living like Jesus and I'm demonstrating His love among the brethren the same way He did, I shouldn't be afraid in that last day of what's He going to say to me, right? Because I was doing as He did. And that really goes back to that same story, right? Where he says, you didn't, in that particular one, or different versions of that story. He'll say things like, you didn't do these things. You didn't visit the sick. You didn't visit that. Right. But you didn't do it for them. You didn't do it for me. Right. And so that's where the surprise thing sort of comes in. When did we not do this? Right. And so when we're living like Jesus in the way that we love the brethren, then we can have confidence that that's not going to happen to us. We might say in the judgment there.
Yeah. So I also think that this aspect of driving out fear,
Yeah.
there's a lot more fear than just fear of the eternal judgment, fear of not making it to heaven, right? So I think that one of the things that I brought out in my sermon was that the loving your brethren is where it starts. And having the perfect love of Jesus dwelling in you should give you the confidence to also love other people, to take those risks, to say the right things, to go outside of your comfort zone, to sacrifice more. Talked about laying down our lives for the brethren, right? So if we embody perfect love and we are in a mindset of eternity, then the things about this world mean so much less. The fears and the attachments to things, they're meaningless in the big picture if we have the right perspective, and that really starts with love. And but what kind of love is it? It's a sacrificial love. It's but we're also told that we have to be able to love ourselves, right? The healthy love is also one that puts me in the right place with God. So um
Yeah, and I think that's right. Right, there's this idea that it's not just necessarily about the judgment, because it says it drives out fear. Right, perfect love, that's what it does. It drives out our fear. And the one who fears is not made perfect, or has not been made complete in love. And so that idea, I think, is accurate. Right, when I fully understand the love of Jesus, when I have fully understand, when I have a better grasp on the love of Jesus and the love of God and what they've done for me, when I can really start living that out, then those other fears you talked about, right? Those other insecurities become driven out. They become less important. Paul will say in Second Corinthians that we walk by faith and not by sight anymore, right? We don't regard anyone in this way of the flesh, even though we used to regard Christ in that way. There's this idea that these things down here don't really matter, right? Since we know what it is to understand that there's a judgment coming, since we know what it is to have this ministry of reconciliation, he says, then we go about and we're bold. We boldly go out and convince or encourage people to be reconciled to God, because this stuff doesn't matter, right? And so I'm not afraid of those things. And he spends a lot of time in that particular letter saying, I don't care what you say about me. I don't care what anyone says about me. It's before God I stand. It's his commendation that matters, not mankind, right? And so those fears that you have of rejection, those fears you have of spreading the gospel or any of those kinds of things, in Paul's case anyway, that's what drove those out, right? It didn't matter. Those things didn't matter anymore, because he understood this connection he had with Christ and with God. And so those things have been driven out, right? And his whole concern in that letter is the love that I have for you. I want you to be this way. And so he was executing that love as well, or demonstrating it. And so, yeah, I think that's really, really a good point you make there, right? That it's not just about the end, but it's also about all these things we face here as well.
Right. Yep. So we move on into this last little section there. It says in 19, picking up, so we love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. So again, we wrap up this, well, it's not a conclusion because he continues on and talking about love, but we have this section here that says God loved us first. And if you're going to be one of his children and claim to be of God and to claim to love God, and yet you don't pass that love on to your brothers or sisters, you're a liar.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because when you think about this, this verse 19 especially, we love because he first loved us. I think a lot of times we will think of that verse as most directly dealing with, we love God because he first loved us. In fact, I think we have songs I know that you may be familiar with as well, different songs we sing in our churches that's this idea, right, that expresses that he loved us, so we love him, and that's fine. But I think here in 19, it's what you've just said, right? We love not him, we love others because he first loved us, right? Like that's the connection that John is trying to make here. Certainly the other is true, and we can find that in the scripture, but here he really is saying we love others because he first loved us, because his immediate statement is hates his brother and sister. So it wouldn't make sense, right, for him to be talking about God directly. And he just said above there as well, it's about this love that's among us. It's made complete among us. So I think what he's really trying to get at is that we could insert that word, right? We love the brethren because he first loved us. That's why we do it. That's what motivates us to love others, is the love that God put to us. So it's not God loved me, so I love him back. It's God loved me, so I love others. And in so doing, right, when I love others, when I've mastered that skill, we might say, of loving others, then I can make a claim to loving God. I can't make a claim to loving God immediately, right, if
Right.
I have not first loved the brethren, because he says that's impossible. You've never seen God. How can you say you love him, right? You've seen your brothers and sisters. Demonstrate it there first, right? Like, show
Mhm.
me and then tell me that you love me, right? And so that's really the point he's trying to make, and that's
Yep.
why he follows up with that. He gave us this command, right?
Yeah.
Anyone who loves God must also love his brother and his sister. And so I think that's really that wrap up, if you will, like you kind of said. It's a little bit of a concluding thought here in this whole God to us to the brethren, the love in us,
Mhm.
and how we can know through that. And so, really, I would encourage people to sort of think about that verse, especially in that way, right?
Yeah.
Um,
They go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other.
that's right, and that's right. You can't love God without loving the brethren, and you really can't love the brethren without loving God. I mean, that's kind of how it's constructed here. And
Mhm.
you could say, well, I can love the brethren without loving God, right? I could.
Mhm.
Well, no, you can't, because they're not your brothers. You can love those people without loving, right? You could love those
Right.
people without loving God, maybe, but you can't love the brethren because we're all children of God. If you're not his
Yep.
children, you're not loving the brethren. You're just loving
Yeah.
random strangers.
Yeah. I think that again, I've been fixated on this idea of being created in the image of God.
Yeah.
Right. That was what my sermon was basically all about, and that understanding the aspects and the characteristics of God, and then with the idea that God made us to be like Him in all of these ways. So God is love. John points it out,
That's
all
right.
the big ones. God is light. In him is no darkness. If we say we are of the light, like he is in the light, right? God is love. If we say we love God and yet don't love our brethren, we're liars, because we can't be of God and not love. And so just the idea that God put us here and created us in his likeness and in his image so that we will be like him, right? And think about the beautiful idea that if everybody just loved their brethren and loved their neighbor, the world would be a completely different
Yeah,
place.
for sure.
Like, right? It would
Yep.
be an amazing. It would be an amazing world. And people think about, like, oh, well, we need this political system or that political system or all these things. No, we just need to all be like God,
Yeah, that's right. If we could get that worked out, we'd have it down,
right?
right?
Yeah.
Uh,
And so, but I don't know. It just kind of takes me to a different place when I think about the intended purpose of humanity
yeah,
was to be like Him.
yeah, and that's really sort of I mean, all the pictures that you get, from the beginning on down, is this idea of this relational God where He creates Adam and Eve, right, and He walks in the garden with them,
Mhm.
right, and so that just keeps going, and so you get that again here with this idea, which is not only unique to here, about this family sort of relationship, and that's an interesting idea for me. Is whoever claims to love God and hates his brother or his sister, the picture there is, God is the father, we are his children, we are all his children, from earlier in the sermon here. And so what he's saying is, look, you claim to love your father, but you hate your brothers and your sisters. Now compare that to a human family, right? um, the picture there is, the family is contained in this unit of love, or is this unit of love. And you can't
Mhm.
say, well, I love my parents, but I hate my brothers and sisters, my physical brothers and sisters.
Right.
We do that. I mean, people do that. I've known people who, hate their brothers and their sisters, yet they claim to have a loving family because they love their mom and their dad, right? But you go, that's a dysfunctional family, is what we would say. And the way God would say it is, you're a liar, right? Because if you can't love your brother and sister, you can't love your parents either, is sort of the picture that he's painting here. And specifically in this case, you haven't seen him, but that picture there is supposed to be of what a good family looks like. And there's a lot of ideas that God has used that picture of the family and used that picture of him being the father and us being children, and to sort of illustrate what our family should look like, but also the natural way it's our families should run, right,
Mhm.
is supposed to help us understand God better, whom we've not seen. And
Right.
so when we break down those family relationships as well, right, if I don't treat my children correctly, then the problem is one day they go and say, God is your father. And they go, well, my father was a jerk, right? Don't tell me about a
Yeah.
father, right? Same thing here. You hate your brothers and sisters in your own physical family. Well, then how are you going to love your spiritual brothers and sisters in a church family, right? Like that's the teaching ground where all those things happen. And so he's picking up on that idea here as well, right? That we must love our brother and sister physically, and then that will then lead eventually to spiritual. We'll understand that relationship better. That's why he uses those terms here, is to help us understand that relationship.
Absolutely. Why don't you take the next section and we'll go into chapter 5 and see how far we can go.
Yeah, let's dive right in there. So, chapter 5 then starts: everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands, and his commands are not burdensome. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. So maybe we just stop right there for a minute, right? So we'd kind of been talking a little bit, in the last couple of weeks about how, once you get past about chapter 3-ish, you turn sort of from this attention to idols more to this attention of who the true God is, right? And so you kind of see some more of that here, right? Who Jesus is, who the
Mhm.
Father is, what's going on there, right? And so this is about the true God and what he's about. And he starts with this idea of believing that Jesus is the Christ, which is not new, right? He was talking about that with the spirit of the Antichrist and how you can test the spirits and these sorts of things, right? And so now he's adding a new thing to this, right? Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, right? So that's that father-child relationship there, and tying into the verses above. And everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. And so that's an interesting now sort of layer, maybe, right? Because he had just said before, the one who loves God must love his brother and sister. And now he says, everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well, which, since he just said everyone who believes Jesus is born of God, that must be the brothers and sisters. Yet also, when we think about his child, right? We're also now thinking about Jesus is the Christ, right?
Mhm.
That's also the Son of God, right? And so, if you love God, you love Jesus. Why? Because you believe that he is the Christ. And that's a really throwbacky kind of thing for me, back again to John and his relationship with Jesus on the earth, and how much time Jesus spends in John's gospel talking to the people of his day, right? That you're not Abraham's children, right? You're not of your God is not your father, right? Because if God was your father, you would listen to me. You wouldn't hate me
Mhm.
and try to kill me, right? And so you're of your father, the devil. So he had said those kinds of things to the people of his day about, I am the Son, and if you love the Son, you love the Father, and vice versa, right? And John is like remembering that, if you will, right? And
Right.
pulling that idea in here about, if you love the Son, you love the Father also. But now he's making application to not just, the only begotten Son, but also all who believe Jesus are children of God as well. And so it's that same idea almost, that, listen, you can't love the Father without loving the Christ. And now he's saying, and it's the same thing here, guys, right? Everyone who believes Jesus, you gotta if that person believes Jesus is the Christ, you gotta love them because they're his child,
Right.
right? And
And
then
and then he
he's gonna
talks about commandments,
yeah, he's
right?
gonna ask that
So
question. How do we know we love the children of God, right? How do I know I love the children of God?
yeah,
There you go, right? And so he's gonna lay those out.
yep.
Uh,
And I mean, what commandments are we talking about?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the first one you'd have to think about is right in 21, right? Because in verse 21, he says, he's given us this command. Anyone who
Hmm.
loves God must love their brother and sister, right?
Right.
And so this is how we know the love of the children of God by loving God and carrying out his commands. Well, the first one I should think of is clearly what he just said, half a breath ago, right? That,
Hmm.
I'm supposed to love my brother and sister. That's got to be the first one that comes to mind.
Right.
But then he kind of keeps going a little further than that, right? In fact, this is love for God, right? He kind of goes, and let me tell you something as well. What is it to love God? It's to keep his commands. And so I think that's now maybe expanding that out to a bigger circle of the things that God has said, right? Where you hear these ideas of, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and you don't do the things that I tell you, right?
Hmm.
If you want to demonstrate your love for God, then you do the things that he says.
Right.
And that's, I think, a good parallel as well to sort of a father-child relationship, right? Like, I mean, you have children, I have children, right? How do our children express that they love us? Well, do the things I ask you, right? It's great that you're
Yeah.
doing all these other things on Father's Day and whatever, but I'd rather the rest of the year you follow my teachings and my directives and my things
Yeah.
like that, right? That's how you show me you value and cherish whatever I'm doing for you, or we would say that you love me, right? And so he's pulling that same thing here, right? And then he follows it up with, and they're not even that hard, right? They're not a burdensome thing to do. So I think that's really an important idea that, look,
Yep.
it is, and that's not new here either, right? He spent the whole first 3 chapters talking about, walking in the light as he's in the light, right? And, we say we do this, but, we can't be wicked children and claim God as our father. This is not a new thing he's saying. The way we live and the way we do
Yep.
has got to line up with that.
When you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, of course, a lot of those core principles that Jesus taught, right out of the gate in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about us being light. You are the
Yeah.
light of the world, right? A city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nobody lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. No, they put it up on a lampstand so that all the light can brighten everybody in the house, right? And then he says, "You're the salt of the earth." But he says, "Let your light." What is the light? Well, he says, "Let your light shine before men." That's before the other people that God also created like you, right? "Let your light shine before men so that they might see what? Your good works."
Yeah.
So
And then
we are
glorify the
called,
Father in heaven, right? Because
yeah.
that they know they're
And
connected, right?
you are then taking your light, which is given to you by God, and demonstrating your love for people through good works. And so the light that we have is supposed to be the product of light is good works.
Yeah.
And the product of love is basically the same thing, is good works for our brethren, lifting people up, taking care of them, easing their burdens and all these things. And so light and love, they're synonymous, really, if you think about it.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of just semantics and maybe how we think about things. But ultimately, we're called to do, and not just, it's not a feeling. Oh, I really have fondness for them. It reminds me of Jesus in that conversation with Jesus and Peter. When Jesus, and it's unfortunate in the English language,
Yeah. Yeah.
we just have the one word for love,
Yep.
right? But time and time again, they're using different words for love in this conversation that Peter's having. He
Yeah.
says, "Peter, do you love me?" "Well, you know I really like you, Jesus." Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of what Peter's saying there, right?
Yep.
But Jesus, time and time again, do you love me? And finally, Peter says, "Yes, Lord, I love you." He said, "Well, feed my sheep, tend my sheep."
Yep.
What is he saying?
Yeah.
Do
Do
good
something. Right?
works
Do something.
for the brethren,
Yep.
right? It's the same thing. And so if we want to grow in our faith, start at home and start at your home church by doing more for them.
Yeah, and I think that's really this idea that he says about his commands not being burdensome. I mean, certainly if we tie that idea to the commands being to love the brethren, that shouldn't be difficult in that way. But even if I think about all the commands of God in a broader sense, I mean, sometimes we do think, as maybe especially as we're younger or whatever, right? That, oh man, it's hard to be a Christian, right? Oh, it's a burden. It's these things I have to do, these things I have to give up, these things I don't get to do, et cetera, right? But I like the idea that he says here. He's not necessarily saying, we think about burdensome. We think that it's a hard or easy kind of a thing, but I don't think that's it, right? Some of the things that we're called to do are hard, right? They're challenging, they're difficult, but they're not a burden, right? They're not something that drives us and weighs us and pushes us down. And the reason why he says here, right, is it's not necessarily that the commands themselves, right, are burdensome or not, but it's the commands are not burdensome because, right, for everyone born of God overcomes the world, right? The reason that it's not burdensome has nothing to do with the difficulty or the easiness of the burden, right? It has nothing to do with the weight, we might say, of the thing we're asked to carry. It has to do with the strength of the one who carries it, right? So there's sort of two ways that you can lighten a burden, right? One is you can remove the burden, right? If I got to carry 50-pound sacks of concrete, right? One way you can remove my burden is you can pick it up and take it off of me. Or the other thing is I could just get stronger, right? And if I'm stronger, then that's not burdensome anymore, right? What is heavy for a 3-year-old is not heavy for me, right? And that's what he's saying here. The commands are not burdensome because if you've been born of God, you've already overcome the world, right? And so if you've overcome the world, then none of this stuff is heavy. None of this stuff is a burden. None of this stuff drives you to despair. Because, and this is why, right? This is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. Right. And so the thing which gives us this strength, the thing which allows us to carry is our faith. And we have a song for that as well, right?
We sure do.
Faith is the victory, right? That overcomes the world. And again, if you're not sure who that is, well, is that me, right? How do I know that I've overcome the world? Then he answers that for you. Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. That's the one who has overcome the world. And the reason for that seems, self-evident to me, right? And that is because Jesus has overcome the world, right? And again, he had told the disciples that when he was here. John is remembering this, right? That, Jesus told him, I have already overcome the world, right? And so the same thing here. You believe Jesus is the Son of God. He overcame the world. You've overcome the world as well. Then you've overcome the world. Nothing that you can have is going to be burdensome in that way that will crush you or drive you down. Because his commands are not that way. We've already overcome all the difficulties and challenges that the world may throw at us in that way. And so, so you can go ahead and love God, right? Keep his commands. They're not burdensome. You've already overcome. Just go ahead and do it now, right? Get to doing.
Well, let's take us into the next section there.
Yeah. So then verse 6, talking about this Son of God, right? And this Jesus, this is the one who came by water and blood, Jesus the Christ. He did not come by water only, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit who testifies, because the Spirit is the truth. For there are 3 that testify, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and the 3 are in agreement. And maybe we should stop there for a second before we get into this other bit of testimony that he's talking about. So there's a lot sort of going on there, but I think the first thing maybe we want to address at least is this idea that people may or may not be familiar with, and that is this idea of why is it important that there's 3 testimonies or 3 testifying, right? It seems important that John points this out. There are 3 that testify, or 3 that give testimony. And really that goes back to the law, right? That goes back to the law of Moses, where you had to have 2 or 3 witnesses to give corroborating testimony in order for something to be, established, in order to, carry out a sentence of judgment against someone. One eyewitness was not good enough. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses. And that will get used in other places as well. I mean, Paul uses that language again in the Corinthian letters, where he says, this is the 3rd time I'm coming to you, and by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so he seems to say, every time I've come, that counts as one of the 3, right? And so that idea there is why John is bringing up this 3 witness sort of thing, right? He's bringing up that he's throwing it back or tying it back to the law and to the principle that God has established through that, right? And so he's saying there are 3 testimonies, or 3 that testify, and they are in agreement. Now, the thing they're agreeing about and the thing they're testifying about is Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, right? Like that's the testimony that these 3 things are pointing to, are saying. And so now here's the 3, right? The Spirit, the water, and the blood. These 3 give testimony about Jesus being the Christ, about Jesus being the Son of God. And so what he wants his readers to understand is, so you can count on that being true because it's been established by the mouth of 3 witnesses. That's what John is doing here. Now, what are these 3 things? It becomes the question maybe that people will go, well, what are these 3, right? But before we even dig that, you got to understand, why is he doing that? What's this whole thing about? If you don't understand Jewish law a little bit, then you're going to be confused there by what's going on. So you want to take a shot at what those are, or you got a idea of what he's saying?
I mean, so for me, one of the studies I did was about baptism. And the relationship between the Spirit and water has been there from the beginning. So in the beginning, when God had said the Spirit was hovering over the face of the water.
Yeah.
So there was this relationship between water and the Spirit from the beginning. We see, the Spirit present at the baptism of Jesus. When Jesus came out of the water, the Spirit was hovering over the face of that water as well, anointing Jesus, at his baptism, and then confirmed by God saying, this is my beloved Son, right? And then in Acts chapter 2, we have the sermon at the Pentecost, Peter's sermon. The Spirit was involved there. He came down and came upon the apostles like flames of fire, and they spoke in a way that everybody could understand them. There were, I don't know, like 17 different distinct nations or dialects represented, and everybody heard the message in their own language. And then you have the confirmation that Peter said there about baptism, that you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit through this water baptism. Now, regarding blood goes back to the old law and the need for the blood is life in this world. And that sacrificing the blood means that a life was lost on behalf of something else. And so when you have the Spirit and the water and the blood, it's this trifecta, this culmination, right, of perfection, basically, embodied in Jesus and what he did for us. That's what I read into a lot of this, but I'm sure you can expand on it.
No, I think you're right on there, right? I think this idea of the water and the blood and the Spirit. So the Spirit is the Spirit who's given testimony, right? It is the Spirit who testifies, the Spirit of truth, right? And so I think that's pretty clear that he's talking about the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, right? This 3rd person, for lack of a better term, in the God deity, right? And so this idea then that the Spirit has given testimony, I think everyone's like, okay, that seems pretty straightforward. And the other is then the water and the blood. And I think you're right. I think this idea of the water especially has to do with this idea of baptism. And I would say it's most clearly demonstrated, like you say, in Jesus's baptism there, right? What happened there, right? He's baptized, he comes out, the Spirit descends like a dove, and then what happens? There's a testimony, right? And what's the testimony? This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased, right? And that's what's under consideration in verse 5. you have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Well, why should you? Well, you should, because remember the water scene? Remember where God testified himself about this is the Son, right? This is the Son.
Yep.
And so I think that's pretty clear there. And then this idea of the blood, I think really ties into sort of the crucifixion idea there, right? This atoning sacrifice that was made. If you go back to chapter 4, I'm looking it up on my other screen here. Chapter 4, 9 and 10, right? We see this is the love of God that was made manifest. God sent his Son into the world so that we might live through him. And this is love, not that we've loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sin, right? And so back there in chapter 4, he's tied in this idea of this is the Son. And how do you know he's the Son? You know he's the Son because God sent him to be the atoning sacrifice, which seems weird that's how you would know he's the Son. But he says he sent his Son into the world to be a sacrifice, to die, to give the blood. And so I think what he's pointing out is you've got all these things now in agreement, right? The baptism scene where God has proclaimed it, the water, the blood where Jesus dies and carries out the work of the Son, right? Where he says, this is my will of the Father to do what he wants, right? And so he says that's another thing, that the death itself signifies that he was the Son. And now the Spirit testifies also, right? The Spirit testifies that Jesus is the Son. That goes back again to sort of chapter 4 as well, right? Test the spirits. How do you know? Well, every spirit that says, right, that Jesus, this is the Spirit of truth. If they testify that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus was the Christ. So he's saying you got all these three things now in agreement, right? The water, the blood, the Spirit, they all testify that Jesus is the Son of God. And the reason that's important for John anyway is so you can believe it. And that's then what verse 9 says, right? We accept human testimony. I think the idea there is, 3 witnesses under the law, 3 humans testifying about something you would accept, right? We accept human testimony, but God's testimony is greater because it is the testimony of God, which he has given about his Son, right? And so that's really what he's saying here. If you would take the word of 3 human witnesses on something, you should certainly take the 3 God witnesses on something, the crucifixion, the baptism scene, and the Spirit now testifying himself that he is the Son of God. So I don't know if maybe that's a good place to stop there for a minute and pause about that. We can pick up with verse 10 maybe next time. But because then he wants to talk about the one who believes the testimony. What about that, right?
Yep. Of course, the last verse we can circle back again and talk about idols again. Like one big perpetual cycle. But I think that's a pretty good place to stop. And we may end up having a 1-week delay in our final episode of this section, only because Kevin's going to be out of technology land for a span. But we will be able to finish this up next time we get together, and then we'll also be able to transition into a new book. Probably just wrap this up and then start maybe the intro of the next book or topic that we decide, which is TBD at this moment. So and if you all have any ideas or suggestions or things that you would like to study, we would certainly love to get some inspiration for that, whether it's another book or if it's a topical study that might take a little bit more of a broad study throughout the scriptures about something that you want to know about. That'd be fine as well. So, well, thank you so much, everybody. I hope this study has been beneficial for you. If you have any needs, as always, we feel free to send us an email, send us a comment on the YouTube or the Facebook or the Spotify or wherever you're seeing this. And that's about it. So you got any final words, Kev?
No, just again, your takeaway here is the same as it's been the last time, right? John's really harping on this, right? If you get nothing out of it, love the brother, right? That's your homework again this week.
Yeah. Well, and that's a lifelong work, really.
Yes, that's right.
So
You can't ever check it
All
off.
right. No, it's not. It's not a one and done type of thing. Baptism may be something that we only do one time, and yet we can continually be renewed in mind and spirit,
Sure.
and in purity and all the other things. So, hope this is beneficial for you. God bless you, everybody, and we will see you next time.